forgive her for that. And and master's in public health from Harvard Public School, Harvard School of Public Health. She received the Women in Cancer Research Award in 2013, and minority scholar. She's a minority scholar in Cancer Research Award in 2010, both from the American Association for Cancer Research. She also received the Fellows Award for Research Excellence from NIH in 2014. In 2018, Dr. Nogueira was inducted to the UT College of Natural Sciences Hall of Honors, and in 2020 she received the outstanding Young Texas X Award in 2020. So yeah, we really have someone who can just shower us with a lot of knowledge regarding this topic. So I hope everyone enjoys this. Without further ado, I'll just let her take the stage.
Thank you so much, Nishi, for the very kind introduction. I appreciate it. I'm going to keep my camera off just because our internet has been a little hiccupy this morning. But hopefully I can turn it back on whenever we have the discussion. I appreciate the opportunity to talk to all of you today. Climate change is the greatest threat to human health of our time. If when I say this, you think about rising sea levels or an increase in vector-borne diseases in faraway countries, think again. Climate change is already impacting the health of individuals across the United States. This is happening right now here in this country. I'll give you a few examples. Climate change alters the frequency and behavior of extreme weather events. Take wildfires, for example. Wildfire activity is closely tied to temperature and drought, both of which are impacted by climate change. The graph to the right here shows wildfires from 1990 at the top to 2019 at the bottom, with months in the x-axis. And as you can see, there's been an increase in wildfire activity in the United States, no matter how you measure it, by area burned, by number of large fires, by fire season length. This, combined with the growth of the wildland-urban interface, or the area where houses and wildland vegetation intermingle, which has also been growing since the 1990s, no matter how you measure it, by area, by housing unit, by population, leads to an increase in exposure to wildfires. And if you're picturing California in your head, you might want to take a look at this map showing the distribution of the wildland-urban interface in the United States. It's not necessarily concentrated in Western states. Okay, so what do wildfires have to do with carcinogens? Because wildfires burn everything in their path, wildfire smoke is different. It contains particles and chemicals not only from the combustion of biomass, such as PM 2.5, but also from the combustion of man-made materials, including household products and building materials that contain chemicals such as benzene and formaldehyde, which are well-known carcinogens. So of course, with a rising wildfire exposure, you also have a rising exposure to carcinogens. And wildfire smoke doesn't stay in one place. It can impact air quality miles away from the wildfire location. In addition to smoke, wildfire ash and debris also contain non-carcinogens, such as lead, arsenic, cadmium, asbestos, PHAs, that can contaminate public water sources. The extreme heat or the high heat during wildfires can also melt plastic pipes, releasing carcinogens into the water system. So we saw how climate change leads to an increased activity of wildfires, which leads to an increased exposure to the carcinogens that are present in wildfire smoke, ash, and debris from the combustion of biomass and man-made materials. Here's another example. Climate change alters the behavior of extreme weather events. Warmer air holds more water vapor, which increases the water capacity of hurricanes. Take Hurricane Harvey, for example. With Harvey, it wasn't so much the wind, but the fact that the storm stalled over Houston, and then it rained, and then everything flooded. Here you see a map from the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, NOAA, showing the rainfall over Houston during Hurricane Harvey. And NOAA had to create or add a new color to their legend because it had never rained so much in one spot before. This is a problem because Houston, where Harvey hit, is known as the refinery and chemical plant capital of the United States. So side by side with the map from NOAA showing the rainfall in Houston during Harvey is a map from ProPublica showing the concentration of carcinogens from industrial pollution in the Houston area. Hurricane Harvey's unprecedented precipitation, which climate change made 3.5 times more likely to happen, flooded chemical plants, oil refineries, and Superfund sites that contain vast amounts of carcinogens, which were released into the Houston community. You probably remember seeing the Arkema chemical plant explosion in the news. Refrigerated trailers that were storing unstable chemicals lost all source of primary and emergency backup power. The chemicals decomposed and caused the explosion, which released carcinogens in the air, water, and soil around the plant. Also during Harvey, oil refineries shut down operations and started flaring off their excess chemicals, which they do to avoid explosions. The problem is that flaring releases far greater volumes of toxic air pollution and carcinogens than normal, already polluting operations. And during what is called these exceptional events, oil refineries are exempt from fines that they usually would have to pay for exceeding pollution limits. As you would expect with climate change, these exceptional events are not so exceptional anymore. Oil refineries started flaring excess chemicals and releasing greater amounts of carcinogens again during the Texas winter storm in 2021, and they have no incentives to change this practice. Just in case you're not familiar with how global warming or climate change can lead to winter storms, there is a strong jet that usually confines cold air to the north. Climate change is leading to faster warming in the poles, which decreases the temperature difference that usually stabilizes the course of this jet. The smaller the temperature difference, the more the wind belts become unstable and create these lobes instead of a straight line. Do these lobes look familiar? So we saw how climate change alters the behavior of storms, such as increasing the water capacity of hurricanes and increasing wildfire activity. And it makes it harder to prepare and respond to increasingly unpredictable extreme weather events, leading to an increased release and exposure to carcinogens in the surrounding communities. This being the B2A conference Bridges to Access, I also have to mention the changing behavior of extreme weather events doesn't only impact exposure to carcinogens, it also leads to disruption in access to care. With Hurricane Harvey, for example, it wasn't the first time Houston had been impacted by a hurricane. The hospitals thought they were prepared. They all had an emergency preparedness plan. They had backup generators. Like we saw, Harvey was different. It stalled over Houston, then it rained, then it flooded, then the backup generators flooded. Extreme weather events can damage medical infrastructure, break transportation links, disrupt supply chains, all of which lead to disruptions in access to care. Hurricane Maria, for example, damaged several IV bag factories in Puerto Rico, which impacted care delivery throughout the United States. At the American Cancer Society, we focus on access to care among individuals who have been diagnosed with cancer, of course. And we have previously conducted a study looking at the impact of hurricanes on cancer patients. The American Cancer Society is co-sponsored of the National Cancer Database with the American College of Surgeons, which is a hospital-based cancer registry that collects information on over 70% of cancer cases in the United States. We linked the National Cancer Database with FEMA data that has information on residential disaster declarations to identify facilities that had been impacted by a hurricane. This allowed us to evaluate the impact of hurricanes on cancer patients receiving radiation therapy. We chose radiation therapy because it's highly dependent on electricity, which is frequently disrupted by hurricanes. It requires the presence of a specialized team, which is also made difficult by hurricanes, and it must be given daily, so patients have to have access to the facility, which is extremely hard if everything is flooded. For patients with aggressive tumors, such as non-operable locally advanced non-small cell lung cancer, treatment breaks as small as 2 days can impact survival. So we identified patients whose facility had been impacted by a hurricane during their treatment, and then we matched them with similar patients who completed their treatment at the same facility, but at a time when no disasters had been declared. And we saw that patients whose facility had been impacted during their radiation treatment took longer to complete treatment and had worse overall survival. Not only that, the longer the disaster declaration lasted, which can be used as a proxy for how big of an impact the hurricane had on that community, the worse the overall survival. A lot of times when I present the results from this study, people say, well, yeah, but how many patients or how many facilities are really impacted by a hurricane? So this map shows facilities that have been impacted by a hurricane in the United States in the past 5 years. As you can see, these are highly populated areas, so we expect many patients to be impacted, and it has some of the larger cancer centers in the United States. We estimated that about 63% of healthcare facilities in the US had been impacted by a hurricane in the last 5 years. Hurricanes, of course, are just one type of disaster. If you count all the different types of disaster declarations in FEMA, the number changes. 99% of healthcare facilities were in a county where a presidential disaster was declared by FEMA in the past 5 years. I want to pause here and go back to this statement. Climate change is already impacting the health of individuals across the United States. I gave you a few examples of how climate change is altering the frequency and behavior of extreme weather events and how that leads to an increased exposure to carcinogens and disruptions in access to care. But I want you to notice what is not in the examples I gave you so far. There has been no future projections. Climate change is already here. It's already impacting our health. The rise in carcinogens is not a consequence of climate change. The rise in carcinogens shares a common cause with climate change, and that is our reliance on fossil fuels. Consumption of fossil fuels leads to increased air pollution that is driving the greenhouse effect. And the same pollution also increases lung cancer risk. The association between vehicle emissions and lung cancer risk is well known, and the one that is most readily available to our memories because we see and smell air pollution from vehicles every day. However, extracting, processing, and moving fossil fuels releases many carcinogens in the environment long before they are burned. Take fracking, which is used to extract natural gas, for example. Piped natural gas must continuously be repressurized at compressor stations, which emit methane, PM2.5, benzene, formaldehyde, and other carcinogens. Then there's the waste that flows back up a fracked well. This material that's called brine or produced water also contains carcinogens. It's often hauled by trucks to sites called injection wells. And the carcinogens that are dumped in these injection wells can contaminate water sources, including private wells. Many homes, especially in rural areas, rely on private wells for drinking water. I think we've all seen this picture before. You should not be able to light the water coming out of your kitchen faucet on fire. Another type of fossil fuel extraction method is mountaintop removal, which is used to extract coal. Mountaintop removal to extract coal is exactly what it sounds like. Coal companies literally remove the top of mountains with dynamite and earth removing machines that are called draglines in order to reach the coal seams. Plumes of toxic arsenic and other heavy metals are released into the air during mountaintop removal blasting, and then the waste rock, which is also full of carcinogens, is pushed into adjacent valleys, buried in streams, and of course the carcinogens can leach into groundwater. Water, sediments, and fish tissue that is collected near these coal extraction sites often have concentrations of carcinogens, including nickel, lead, cadmium, that exceed government standards. Then there is processing. Our reliance on fossil fuels goes beyond energy production, of course. Petroleum products include fuel, chemicals, plastic, many of which are life-saving products used routinely by the healthcare community, as the oil companies like to remind us. So how much do oil refineries contribute to the rising carcinogens? Have you ever heard of Superfund sites? Superfund sites are polluted locations in the United States requiring a long-term response to clean up hazardous materials contaminations. The name Superfund site means that government funds can be used to clean up these sites. It came from legislation Congress passed back in the 1980s. And as you can imagine, whenever government funds are involved, it takes a lot to be considered a Superfund site. And a quick search of Superfund sites will help you understand just how much processing of fossil fuels contributes to the rising carcinogen. Every other Superfund site used to be an oil refinery. And oil refineries in operation today still release carcinogens in the air, including PM 2.5, nitrogen oxide, carbon monoxide, hydrogen sulfide, and sulfur dioxide. The water, some refineries use deep injection wells to dispose of wastewater, which, as we saw, can contaminate water sources, and the soil. And soil contamination is common from coke dust and sludges, and from leaks, spills, and during transportation, all of which release carcinogens in the environment. And then, of course, carcinogens are released when we burn fossil fuels, which we do often. Coal, for example, is burned to generate electricity. Coal-fired power plants are responsible for 42% of mercury emissions in the United States, plus PM 2.5 emissions and many other carcinogens. The process of burning coal generates coal ash. Coal ash is a catch-all term for several kinds of waste created by power plants that burn coal. These include arsenic, chromium, lead, mercury. And despite containing several known carcinogens, coal ash is classified as solid waste instead of toxic waste. Solid waste is the same designation given to your household garbage, which means environmental regulation for how toxic waste is handled and disposed of does not apply to coal ash. So coal ash is usually mixed with water and stored in these coal ash ponds, which have a tendency to leak, of course, and flood and spill, sometimes in catastrophic amounts, such as what happened in 2008 in Tennessee. So as we switch to everything electric, it's a good idea to ask, where is that electricity coming from? What is the environmental impact of how it's generated? Nearly 20% of the US electricity today is still generated by coal. Considering the environmental impact of energy sources is important at our homes, of course, and also at our institutions where we work, where we go to school. The healthcare system is the second most energy-intensive industry in the United States. Carbon emissions from the US healthcare system alone exceed the carbon emissions of the entire United Kingdom. If reducing your energy consumption at your home is beneficial, what would reducing energy use or changing the energy source at your institution do? Increasing use of clean energy sources, especially those generated on site, can reduce the carbon footprint of institutions and also make them more resilient to power outages that are only expected to become more frequent with climate change. Did you know that the pharmaceutical industry is 50% more carbon intensive than the automotive industry? As we saw, paradoxically, the production of pharmaceuticals and medical devices from petroleum can lead to carcinogens being released in the environment. How energy efficient are medical devices used at healthcare institutions? How long do they last? How are they disposed of? The healthcare system also purchases significant amounts of food and can decrease its environmental impact by seeking low carbon food manufacture, shipment, and waste options. And waste not only at the table, but way before the food gets there. Waste released from pork farms, for example, are pumped into manure lagoons, which similarly to ash ponds have consequences for the environment and for the health of individuals residing in nearby areas. Also, meat from ruminants has the highest environmental impact, no matter how you measure it, per unit weight, per serving, per unit of energy, per protein weight. If you consider the emissions that are associated with the production, processing, and transportation of feed, the methane emissions by the ruminants, the energy consumption at the feedlots, the amount of antibiotics and pesticides that are used, and the amount of waste that's generated, then it's easy to understand why the environmental impact of meat production is so significant. And if that wasn't enough, red meat is a carcinogen. Consumption of red meat is associated with increased risk of colorectal cancer. There are several guidelines available for adopting menu choices that sustain the health and well-being of the environment, communities, and the people who are producing and eating the food. And then, of course, there is waste. What happens to the waste that's generated by your institution? Healthcare Without Harm has a list of strategies that are aimed at reducing the environmental impact of healthcare institutions. And due to the health co-benefits of strategies that are aimed at addressing climate change, reducing healthcare system emissions can contribute to broader efforts to address climate change and promote better health outcomes for patients everywhere. And if you're thinking, this lady is crazy, my institution would never do any of that. Let me ask you something. Are you allowed to smoke on campus? How do you think that happened? How did it start? So, in conclusion, we need to recognize that our reliance on fossil fuels is a shared cause of both climate change and the rise in carcinogens. Remember, we don't need future projections or models to figure this out. The extraction, processing, and transportation and burning of fossil fuels generated by pollution is driving the greenhouse effect. And he also initiated the rise in carcinogens that are currently present in the environment. This already happened. This is, unfortunately, still happening. Also, climate change is already impacting the health of individuals across the United States through exposure to health hazards such as carcinogens and disruptions in access to care. And unfortunately, the healthcare system is a large contributor to both climate change and the rise in carcinogens. So what do? We recognize our leverage points beyond our homes, beyond recycling. In our communities, in our institutions, when can our actions have the biggest impact? If you're attending this talk, you most certainly have the power to make a difference. Recognize where your points of influence are. Use your leverage. Move the world. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Nogueira. That was a really, really informative talk. I'm sure everyone on this chat would echo that. I'm going to open the floor up for questions. If anyone has one, I guess you can just go ahead and unmute and ask your questions. You may also drop it in the chat. Yeah, I can just go ahead and read it out too. So Susan Legerzinski asks, do you know what is the impact on child cancer rates? So I'm assuming it's by a rise in carcinogens. Is that right?
Yeah, so there hasn't been any like national or global study on child cancer rates, but that's a very good question because children are more susceptible to exposure to carcinogens. And we saw that. I used to work at the Texas State Health Department in the Houston area where you have all of these pollutants that are frequently flooded because of their smaller bodies and their different metabolism. Exposure to these carcinogens happens much faster in children. And of course, they're constantly putting things in their mouth and their behavior and digging things. So whenever there are carcinogens present in the environment, children are the first ones to be exposed, and it affects them differently. They're more susceptible to it. So this is hard to measure at a global or even national scale, but there are several studies that are done about cancer clusters that you can look up in different states, and frequently around these waste sites or highly industrialized areas, there is an increase of cancer among children.
Are there any other questions? If not, I'm just going to ask some questions that I had myself. My first question to you, Dr. Nogueira, would be um, uh, basically, I like to start with some kind of ray of hope or optimism. So I just wanted to ask, are there any recent developments that we can be optimistic of? It could be policy changes or any significant efforts on like a nonprofit or anything on that level.
Yes, so I love that question. I think that we're always looking for those opportunities. And like you said during the introduction, I definitely focus on policy because I think it can have the biggest impact, right? And we all are bombarded and pay a huge amount of attention to federal policies. But what we don't always recognize is that the federal government and their policies, and even sometimes at the state level, it's very limited in the amount that they can do. So I think that the good news is that we can now pay more attention to local policies there at our county or municipalities that determine, where these waste sites are going to be, how are they going to be cleaned up. There are always opportunities very close to home to contribute to an improvement in the policies that are impacting the production, release, and cleanup of the carcinogens that are in the environment. So I think that the good news is that these opportunities are always there, and we just have to pay attention, because where you can have the biggest impact is not necessarily or always with the large federal policies, but locally. So I can see that there are people from many different places here. Pay attention to the local policies around you and find ways to make a difference there.
Yep, that's a great answer. I think, yeah, definitely we should all be looking for opportunities where we can at least contribute and possibly reducing the impact of these carcinogens in the environment. I'm going to open the floor up again for any questions.
I had a question. If you could enact like any single policy change that you think would be the most beneficial in mitigating the rising cancers caused by climate change, what would that be?
Oh, that's a good one. A single one. I think that a tighter control of emissions, and of course there is not a single one, but the fact that we already know that these are carcinogens, that we already know the health impact that they have, that we're spending all this money trying to clean up, it's a little puzzling that we're still allowing these to be released in this way. So I think that the coal ash, for example, is technically a no-brainer, right? Coal ash is not the same as the banana peels from your kitchen, right? And I think that if they were forced, the cost that would be associated, coal is already not very cost efficient. And if there were additional costs associated, they're really, it's a different pocket issue here, right? The cost from exposure to the coal byproducts is not paid by who's benefiting or profiting from coal. It's paid by the healthcare system, right? So if you force them to clean up this coal ash ponds or treat their waste differently, then the cost is again moved to who is producing this and profiting from this. And then that would bring the profits down, and coal would be less and less feasible, right, as an energy source. So I think that's a no-brainer. It's one of the first ones, I think.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Thank you.
Yeah, are there any other questions?
I have a question. I'm not able to show my.
That's okay. You can go ahead.
Okay, so it was a great talk, by the way. I learned so much. Regarding the contribution from the healthcare system and all the supplies we use, is there any move, or has there been any progress or options for choosing the more environmentally sound I guess resources in the healthcare profession?
Yeah, so that's a very good question. There's that resource I mentioned, Healthcare Without Harm, that has several strategies that can be implemented to reduce the carbon footprint and the environmental contamination that is resulting from healthcare facilities, the entire system. And I'm very happy to see that there's just recently a lot more publications in the New England Journal of Medicine and some other from really prominent researchers and government officials on how to decarbonize the healthcare system. Because the biggest impact of climate change is on our health. So it's kind of a paradox that at the same time, the healthcare system is one of the biggest contributors, right, to climate change, and is releasing carcinogens in the environment as a part of the process. So yes, I think that my favorite resource is Healthcare Without Harm. And as there's been a push, I cannot expect more resources and more ways to think about this to come up so that we can tackle this issue.
And do we see a prominent voice coming from, let's say, the Infectious Disease Society of America, from the physicians in the role of climate? I guess this is not specifically carcinogens because I'm talking about infectious disease, but from those groups, and certainly, I mean, I know the pulmonologists are certainly interested in the impact. Do we see a strong voice coming from them, petitioning and advocating, or is it really, I think the stronger voice has come from those of us who are interested in the environment, but I'm wondering if individual groups have come out, for instance, like pulmonologists or infectious disease, and again, yes. I apologize, it's not really a carcinogen focus, but in some ways, yeah.
No, yeah, I think that, of course, we recognize it goes way beyond carcinogens, right? It's cardiovascular disease, it's infectious diseases.
Right.
There are voices, and they are becoming more common and prominent. And I'm always thinking, the more we give these talks, the more we inform, the more voices there will be. There is a few. There's the Medical Society Consortium on Climate Change and Health that has several, like the American Cancer Society, the American College of Surgeons, the American Lung Association that join and pledge to be environmentally friendly and have climate change as one of their mission priorities. But it is not as loud or prevalent as a voice against smoking cigarettes, right? Yet.
Mm-hmm.
And I think I'm hoping that that's the next one that we will start hearing such a consensus and loud statements about climate change as we do with smoking.
Yeah, I was thinking about that too. It's such a focused single, industry to have made an impact on, and this is so much larger, so much more infiltrating. So sometimes I feel hopeless, but you do see these pockets of culture in practice, and so I do agree with you and believe that we can all do our part to change our local culture of practice. yeah, it does play a big role in influence. It's like peer pressure, you know, it's everyone looks to see what everyone else is doing in their exact community. So even if you've been trained differently, people tend to follow their local community. So yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Those were some great questions. We still have time for a couple more, so I'm just gonna keep the floor open for questions, and feel free to just chime in or drop it in the chat.
Well, I am available if anybody thinks of a question later on. I think my contact information will be available through Nishi. And it's been such a pleasure talking to you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Nogueira. It was nice to have you here, and I'm sure we all learned a lot. I was really excited to even have you here. You're definitely one of the most credible voices in this field, and I'm sure that everyone does echo that. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. I appreciate it. Have a great rest of your day.
You too. Thank you so much.